She boarded the plane in a crumpled wedding dress, eyes swollen from tears, and whispers trailing behind her. He was a single dad, who quietly gave up his first-class seat without asking why. Neither of them knew that this brief encounter born from kindness would change both of their lives in ways they couldn't have imagined. Because she wasn't just a runaway bride. She was a millionaire. And the plane, she owned it. If stories of unexpected grace, quiet courage, and the power of simple kindness speak to your heart, take a moment to subscribe. We've got more stories like this one, waiting to meet you when you need them most. Now let's begin. Jake Merritt didn't fly often. Planes made him nervous, the confined space, the turbulence, the loss of control. But what truly twisted his gut this morning wasn't the flight from Denver to Boston. It was the look on his daughter's face when she asked Will, "You sit with me the whole time Lucy was only 7, small for her age, but sharp as a tack." She had her mother's eyes soft green, always searching. That resemblance still made Jake's chest ache in the quiet hours of the night. Since Claire died, Jake had tried to be everything: the cook, the storyteller, the mechanic, and the emotional anchor. But parenting and grief was like steering a truck through fog. You moved forward, but never fast, never sure. He glanced down at the boarding passes in his hand. One said, First Class 2A. The other, Economy 28C. That was the price of saving for 6 months on a mechanic's salary. He could only afford 1 seat up front. And he chose it for Lucy. She got motion sick on long trips, and her pediatrician had said stretching her legs might help. That, and some ginger candy, which Jake now fumbled for in the side pocket of her pink suitcase. The boarding area buzzed with the usual noise gate agents, announcing final calls, the squeak of suitcase wheels, the low murmur of travelers numbing themselves with phones and coffee. Jake sat quietly with Lucy by his side, handing her a granola bar she'd likely ignore. Then came the sound that snapped his attention, the sharp, embarrassed sob of a woman holding her breath. He turned. Across the room stood a woman in a wedding dress. Not the fancy magazine cover kind, but a simple cream-colored gown, slightly wrinkled and speckled with something that looked like gravel dust. Her veil hung off one side of her head like it had been torn loose in a hurry. Her eyes were red and swollen, her lipstick smudged. But it wasn't the dress or the tears that caught Jake's attention. It was the way the gate agent avoided looking at her. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the agent was saying, voice stiff. "Our policy requires that I can't afford another seat," the woman choked. "Please, I just want to go." A few passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. One woman mumbled something about attention seekers. A man rolled his eyes and pulled his earbuds back in. The agent's voice lowered, but Jake still heard the words. "We can't seat you in economy. You'll need to upgrade or take a later flight." The woman looked down at herself. The dress clung a little too tight to her hips, and the sight of her trying to straighten it, shame heating her face. Fingers trembling made Jake's stomach knot. Lucy tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy. Why is she crying?" Jake rose slowly, ignoring the tight pull in his lower back. He walked to the counter, quiet, but certain, and handed the agent one of the boarding passes. "Give her 2A, he said. The agent blinked. "Sir, are you sure?" I'm sure." Jake glanced at the woman. Nobody should cry like that on a day meant for joy. The woman froze. "You don't have to, I want to," Jake said simply. Then to the agent, "Can my daughter sit with me in economy?" The agent checked her screen and nodded. "We can make that work." Lucy slid her small hand into his as they walked away from the counter. The woman in the wedding dress looked at Jake like she wasn't sure whether to cry again or smile. He didn't need thanks. He just nodded once, brief and kind, before returning to his seat with Lucy. "Who is she?" Lucy whispered. Jake shrugged. "Someone who needed that seat, more than us." A few minutes later, as boarding was called, Jake watched the woman in the wedding dress step quietly onto the plane, head slightly bowed. Other passengers still stared, murmured, but she held her ticket like it was a lifeline. Jake didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he did know what it felt like to be judged for what people saw on the outside, and to carry pain nobody cared to understand. He'd been that man at the grocery store checkout trying to calm Lucy's meltdown while people glared. He'd heard the whispers, "Single dad, must be hard. Poor girl." He knew that loneliness wasn't always loud. It could live in silences and glances, in the subtle way people pulled away. On the plane, Jake and Lucy squeezed into 28C and 28D. He tucked a pillow behind Lucy's head, handed her a coloring book, and tried to forget that his legs were already cramping. The flight would be long, but the moment had been worth it. Somewhere in the front, a woman who had nearly been turned away was now sitting in 2A. And Jake. He sat in the back next to his daughter, watching as she began to draw. He didn't know that this small act of kindness would be the start of something far bigger than he'd ever imagined. He didn't know her name. He didn't know she owned the plane. But fate had already taken its seat. Grace Hollister stared at the seat number on her boarding pass, 2A. The letters swam in her vision, blurred by the shame still burning behind her eyes. She clutched the small beaded purse in her lap and tried to breathe. The man who gave her this seat, the stranger, had already disappeared down the economy aisle with his daughter. He hadn't even asked her name. That in itself had been a small mercy. The flight attendant at the front smiled politely, but said nothing about her appearance. Grace appreciated the silence. It was the first kindness she'd been shown all morning. The seat was spacious, impossibly comfortable. She sank into the cool leather and exhaled slowly. A glass of water was placed in her hand before she could even ask. There was a warm blanket folded neatly beside her, and enough room to curl her legs slightly to the side. Her wedding dress was rumpled, her heels long discarded. She had barely escaped the country club in Aspen where the wedding was meant to take place. She hadn't even packed a real suitcase, just a small overnight bag, a makeup kit, and her passport. Outside the window, the jet bridge pulled away. She gripped the armrest. For the first time in 24 hours, no one was trying to stop her. No one was telling her she was ruining everything. No one was telling her she wasn't enough. She closed her eyes. The image returned anyway. Her mother's face drawn and pale at the top of the marble steps, whispering through clenched teeth. "Grace, stop this nonsense. Do you know how many people are watching?" Grace had whispered back. "I don't love him." To which her mother replied, "You don't have to love him. You just have to say, 'I do.'" That was the final straw. Grace had turned, lifted the skirt of her gown, and ran out the side exit through the rose garden, across the gravel, and into the first cab that didn't ask questions. She had tossed a $1,000 handbag on the seat and said 2 words, "Denver Airport." The driver never even blinked. Now flying 36,000 feet above the pain she'd left behind, Grace tried to imagine what her life might look like next. No more board meetings disguised as brunches. No more being the daughter of Hollister Global, whose opinions only mattered if they aligned with the company's image. No more pretending to be confident in a world that measured her value in dress sizes and dollar signs. She looked down at her bare hands. The engagement ring, 4 carats princess cut, had been left behind on the bathroom sink. She had walked away from everything. And yet, her thoughts drifted back to the man who had given her his seat. He wasn't dressed like a businessman. His clothes were plain, maybe a little worn, well-loved, Grace would have said. His hair was short, a little uneven, like he probably cut it himself. But there was something in his eyes. Not pity, not judgment. Just calm, quiet certainty. The kind you lean on when the storm is loud. And the little girl with him, she was lovely. Freckles. Big eyes. She had clung to his arm with the kind of trust Grace hadn't felt since she was a child herself. It had made her ache. Grace pulled the soft blanket over her lap and leaned against the window. She could still hear his voice when he said nobody should cry like that on a day meant for joy. She wondered if he knew how much that sentence had pierced her. Not because it was romantic, but because it was true. She hadn't been crying because the dress didn't fit. She had been crying because she didn't fit in her own life. Somewhere mid-flight, Grace stood. She ignored the curious glance from the attendant, walked quietly down the narrow aisle, and stopped beside row 28. The man and his daughter were coloring together, crayons scattered across the seat tray, Lucy humming softly. He looked up surprised. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Grace said, clutching the blanket around her like armor. I wanted to say thank you." "Properly." The little girl beamed. "You were the bride." Grace managed a smile. "Yes, kind of. Not really." Jake stood politely, shifting to give her space. "You're welcome. I'm Jake. This is Lucy." Grace shook his hand. "Grace Hollister." Something flickered across his eyes. Not recognition, he clearly didn't know the name. That, too, was a mercy. "Would it be okay," she said softly, "if I sat with you two just for a bit?" He hesitated only a moment, then nodded. And just like that, Grace Hollister left 2A, left the comfort, the legroom, the privacy, and settled into 28B between a mechanic and his daughter. For the next hour they talked. Slowly, at first, then easily. Jake told her how his wife Claire had passed away 3 years ago, how Lucy had inherited her love of music, how he worked long hours repairing tractors and windmills and whatever else broke down in rural Colorado. He didn't complain. He didn't boast. He just was. Steady. Grounded. Grace didn't tell him about the company she technically owned. She didn't mention the private jet she had canceled, or the wedding that had cost 6 figures before she ever said, "I don't." Instead, she told him she liked peanut butter on toast and hated high heels. That she once dreamed of opening a pottery shop in Maine. That she had forgotten how to breathe until this morning. Lucy showed her how to draw butterflies with 3 crayons at once. Grace laughed for the first time in days. When the captain announced their descent, Grace realized the irony. She had spent her entire life in first class, but this was the first time she ever felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Grace returned to her seat in 2A just before landing, but something about it felt different. Now, colder, quieter. The same plush leather, the same elegant legroom, the same perfectly folded blanket. And yet it felt like she was slipping into someone else's life again. She sat down gently, as if not to disturb the version of herself who had occupied this seat 2 hours ago. That woman had been fleeing. This one wasn't quite sure what she was headed toward. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice came through with polite monotony. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into Boston. Please ensure your seatbacks and tray tables are in their upright positions." Grace adjusted her seat, her hands moving automatically. But her eyes drifted back past the curtain separating first class from economy. She could still feel the warmth of Lucy's small fingers wrapped around hers. Still hear the way Jake had said, "You okay with no pressure, no pretense." Jake Merritt. She hadn't expected him. She hadn't expected anything, really. She just needed to get out to run until the noise died down. But kindness, she'd learned, had a strange way of finding people when they least deserved it, especially the quiet kind, the kind that didn't come with strings or expectations. Just a man giving up his comfort for a stranger, crying in a wedding dress. And now, she couldn't stop thinking about him. The plane touched down with a soft jolt. Passengers applauded instinctively. Grace stayed seated, watching the city stretch out beneath the clouds like a second chance. A moment later, a uniformed flight attendant approached. She was older, perhaps in her 50s, with a kind face and a confident stride. "Miss Hollister," she said, lowering her voice with surprising deference. "We've been advised by Mr. Benton that your ground transportation is ready. The car will be waiting on the tarmac." Grace blinked. "Mr. Benton. Your head of security. He was alerted when your name came through the passenger manifest mid-flight." The woman hesitated, then added with a respectful smile. "You gave us quite the scare. Everyone's been looking for you." Grace sighed. "Of course, you can escape the wedding, the expectations, even the headlines, but not the systems that had been built around your last name." She stood, straightened her dress as best she could, and nodded. "Thank you. Shall I inform the driver you're ready?" Grace paused, then shook her head. "No. I'd like to disembark with the other passengers." The attendant looked momentarily confused, then smiled. "Of course, miss." As the plane doors opened and passengers shuffled into the jet bridge, Grace waited, letting the rows ahead of her empty out first. And then she saw them. Jake and Lucy hand in hand. Lucy still had crayon smudges on her fingers, and Jake looked just as steady as before. He carried both bags, hers and Lucy's, without making a show of it. Just a man doing what needed to be done. Grace stepped into line behind them. At the end of the bridge, she gently tapped Jake's shoulder. He turned surprised. "Hi," she said. Again. He smiled. "Hey. I don't really know where I'm going yet," Grace admitted. "So I booked a room at a little place by the harbor, just for tonight." Jake nodded. "Good idea. Take things slow. I was wondering." She paused, nervous. Suddenly, "Would you and Lucy want to join me for dinner? As a thank you, I mean." Jake glanced at Lucy, who perked up immediately. "Will there be bread rolls?" the girl asked. Grace laughed a soft and genuine sound. "There will be so many bread rolls," Jake chuckled. "Then I guess we're in." The Harborside Inn was modest, tucked between a marina and a cobblestone alley that led to a small lighthouse. It wasn't the Four Seasons. Grace liked that about it. There were no bellhops, no signature cocktails, no one snapping pictures or asking if she'd lost weight. Just a warm fire in the hearth and the salty scent of sea air. They sat in a quiet corner of the restaurant tucked away from the handful of other guests. Lucy ordered macaroni and cheese and spent the meal humming between bites. Jake had the meatloaf. Grace ordered seafood chowder and hardly touched it. She was too caught up in watching them, father and daughter. The way Jake cut Lucy's food without being asked. The way Lucy told him about her music lessons and the big audition coming up. The natural rhythm of their bond was magnetic. Jake looked up. "What about you?" Grace blinked. "Me. You ran away from something. That much is clear. But what are you running to?" It was the first time someone had asked her that. Not why she left, but where she wanted to go. "I don't know yet," she said truthfully. "But I'd like it to be something real. Something I build. Not something handed to me with conditions." Jake nodded slowly like he understood more than he said. "I think you're already on the right track." They finished their meal in companionable quiet, interrupted only by Lucy asking for a second dessert. Later that night, back in her room, Grace stood by the window, looking out at the harbor lights dancing on the waves. Her phone buzzed. 23 missed calls. Dozens of texts. Her mother, her fiancé, her family's lawyers. She powered it off. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out the boarding pass from earlier. Seat 2A. A spot she hadn't earned but was given. And now it would remind her of the moment she left the life others had built and began stepping into one of her own. The next morning brought a sky laced with clouds and the scent of salt water drifting through a cracked hotel window. Jake had been awake since dawn, his internal clock stubbornly set by years of early farm calls and tractor repairs. He lay still for a moment, listening to the rhythmic sound of Lucy's soft breathing beside him. She was curled into a ball under a hotel quilt, one hand clutching a stuffed fox she'd had since her mother passed. Jake's chest tightened the way it always did when he watched her sleep, equal parts love, gratitude, and fear. He'd never be enough for her. He eased out of bed without waking her and reached for the weathered metal lunchbox on the table. It was old, scratched, a dull red color that had faded over the years, with the initials CM etched faintly in the corner. Claire Merritt, his late wife, had packed his lunch in that box every day for the first 10 years of their marriage. After her stroke, Jake started using it for Lucy. Now it served another purpose, holding pieces of a life he was trying to preserve. He clicked it open quietly. Inside was a small thermos of hot oatmeal he'd made using the room's kettle, a folded napkin with Lucy's name written in blue. Sharpie, a granola bar, and a note. He wrote one every morning. Today's rid. Lucy, you are brave and bright and loved. Always. Dad, he wasn't sure she even read them anymore, but she never threw them away. That was enough. He'd just finished sealing the box when there was a knock at the door. Not urgent, soft, polite. Jake opened it to find Grace standing in the hallway, hair pulled into a loose braid face, clean of makeup, wearing a navy sweater and jeans that somehow made her look more striking than the wedding dress had. She held 2 paper cups of coffee and offered him one. I figured you'd be awake. Jake took the cup. You figured right. She leaned against the doorframe. Can I steal you 2 for breakfast? Jake hesitated, glanced back at the bed. She's still asleep. Late nights wipe her out. Grace smiled. I'll wait. Or better yet, can I help pack the lunch? Jake blinked, surprised. You want to pack her lunch? Grace nodded. I used to love making lunch for my little cousin when I was a teenager. Her parents traveled a lot, so she'd stay with us. I got really good at cutting sandwiches into hearts. He chuckled and stepped aside. Be my guest, though I warn you Lucy's picky. Hearts might get you a suspicious look. Grace moved to the table and peered into the lunchbox. Is this vintage? Jake closed the door behind them. Belonged to my wife. She used to say if love could fit inside a box, that was it. Grace ran her fingers gently over the initials. She sounds special. She was, Jake said simply. Still is. Lucy doesn't remember much. She was 4 when Claire passed, but we keep little things like this around. It helps. Grace didn't fill the silence with empty words. She just looked at him, really looked, and said, she'd be proud of how you're raising her. Jake swallowed hard. No one had said that to him in years. Lucy stirred not long after, her hair a chaotic halo, as she sat up and blinked sleepily. Is there toast? Better? Grace said brightly. There's someone here who wants to take you out for pancakes. Lucy grinned. With whipped cream, obviously. They walked together to a nearby diner that smelled of bacon grease and maple syrup. The booths were worn but comfortable, the waitresses friendly in that tough love coffee-pouring way that said they'd been doing this since Reagan was in office. Lucy dove into her pancakes like a tiny lumberjack. Grace ordered eggs and fruit, though she mostly picked at the melon. Jake had black coffee and an omelet, grateful for something hot. Conversation came easily. Grace asked Lucy about her upcoming audition. Lucy lit up, describing the grand piano, the judges her song choice. Jake watched with quiet amazement. His daughter had never opened up so quickly to anyone before. Grace didn't talk to her like she was a child. She listened, really listened. At one point, Grace reached across the table and pulled a crayon from Lucy's coloring sheet. Can I draw a fox? Lucy tilted her head. Can you draw a good fox? Try me. 10 minutes later, Grace had sketched a remarkably charming fox with a tiny bow tie. Lucy clapped. You're amazing. You should work at my school. Jake laughed. You might have just found yourself a second job. Grace winked. Only if I get paid in pancakes. After breakfast, as they stepped outside into the crisp morning air, Jake paused. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For being so normal." Grace blinked. "I'm pretty sure that's the nicest thing anyone said to me all year." "I mean it," he added. "You walked off that plane and you had a dozen reasons to act entitled. But you didn't." She shrugged. Maybe I was tired of being the version of myself everyone expected. Maybe I wanted to remember what it felt like to be a human being, not a business proposal. Jake nodded, then reached into the canvas bag slung over his shoulder and handed her something wrapped in a napkin. She unfolded it to reveal a soft cookie, thick and golden. "Chocolate chip," she guessed. "Oatmeal raisin," he corrected. "Claire's recipe. I always pack extra." Grace took a bite and closed her eyes. "You have no idea how long it's been since I tasted something made with love." Jake didn't say anything. He just smiled. And as they walked together down the harbor path, Lucy skipping ahead, the sea wind tangling her braids, neither of them realized that somewhere, something invisible and gentle had shifted. Something small, but real. Something worth holding on to. The following evening, Jake and Lucy returned to their modest rental on the edge of downtown Boston. The small space above a bakery was clean, but worn with creaky floorboards and a scent of cinnamon lingering in the air. They'd be staying here for 2 more nights until Lucy's music audition. It was the kind of place where you had to jiggle the key twice before the door clicked open and the radiator hummed like an old man snoring. Jake flicked on the light. Lucy ran to the window, eager to check if the snow the forecast had promised had begun to fall. It hadn't. Not yet. Jake placed their bags down and sighed, the kind of exhale that only came when a long day settled behind your shoulders. But tonight, the tiredness in his bones was mixed with something lighter, more unfamiliar. Hope. Grace had walked them back to the rental that morning, promising to check in after a business errand. Jake had assumed that would be the end of it, but less than 4 hours later, she'd returned with a stack of books for Lucy and a thermos of hot cocoa that she claimed came from the best cafe in Boston, no debate. And then, just before sunset, she'd invited them both to dinner again, this time at her temporary suite overlooking the harbor. Jake had refused at first. It felt too generous, too lopsided. But Lucy's eyes had sparkled, and Grace had laughed, saying, "It's just soup and sandwiches." "I'm not proposing marriage." Now, standing in the kitchen of their rental, Jake watched Lucy chatter to her stuffed fox about snowflakes and piano pieces. He opened the tin lunchbox, ready to prepare her nighttime snack, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Grace. Something about her didn't add up, and not in a sinister way. She was warm, approachable, self-deprecating, but there was a polish to her gestures, an ease with tipping cab drivers, a confidence in choosing wine at dinner. Things people didn't just learn. They were inherited. Jake didn't push, but he noticed. When they'd first met, she'd been drowning in a dress meant to impress a room full of people she didn't even like. Now, 2 days later, she was in jeans and sneakers hair, up in a messy knot, laughing with his daughter, like they'd known each other for years. And that laugh, it did something to him. Later that night, while Lucy slept, curled under a fleece blanket, Jake sat by the kitchen window, with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Snow had finally started to fall light, powdery and quiet. It covered the world like forgiveness. His phone buzzed. A message from Grace. Still awake, he smiled before he could stop himself. Barely. "You," her reply came seconds later. "Can't sleep. Want to talk?" Jake hesitated only a moment before typing back. "Call or walk?" A beat. Then, walk. They met on the corner near the bakery. Grace had wrapped herself in a gray peacoat, her cheeks pink from the cold. Her breath puffed out in little clouds, and the harbor breeze lifted wisps of hair around her face. Jake's first thought was that she looked free. Not wealthy, not broken, just herself. They walked in silence at first, their boots crunching through new snow street lamps, casting a golden glow along the sidewalk. Finally, Grace spoke. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if one little thing had gone differently?" Jake glanced at her. Every day. She nodded like she'd expected that answer. "If I hadn't gotten cold feet. If the driver hadn't looked the other way when I jumped in the car. If you hadn't given up your seat, you'd still be in Aspen." He finished. She looked over. "Married to a man who sees me as an investment." Jake stopped walking. That what he called? You. Grace's jaw tightened. He said I'd stabilize the brand. That was his proposal speech. Jake's hands curled into fists in his coat pockets. "You deserve better." "I'm starting to believe that." She turned toward him. "And you're more than just the guy in economy who gives up his seat." Jake smiled, but it was gentle. "I'm not complicated. I fix things. I raise Lucy. I survive." "You also listen," she said. "You see people. That's rare." They walked further past darkened shops and shuttered cafes. As they reached a bench near the harbor's edge, Grace stopped. Snow had gathered lightly on the wood, but she brushed it away and sat down. Jake followed. "I used to be afraid of being alone," Grace admitted. "Terrified, actually. Like if I stopped moving, I'd have to feel everything I'd pushed down for years." Jake said nothing. He knew that kind of fear too well. Grace turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm more afraid now of going back to who I was, of pretending again, of losing this, whatever this is." Jake looked at her, really looked, her eyes vulnerable but strong, her shoulders still tense but no longer retreating, and her hands trembling slightly open on her lap as if waiting. He reached for one slowly. She didn't pull away. Back at the rental, Lucy stirred as Jake quietly returned snowflakes, still melting in his hair. He tucked her in again, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She opened one eye sleepily. "Did you go for a walk?" "Yeah," he whispered. "With the pretty lady?" Jake smiled. "Yeah, she makes good cookies." He laughed softly. "She sure does." Lucy yawned. "Can she come to my audition?" Jake paused. "Would you want that?" "Only if she claps loud." Jake leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I think she would." Outside, the snow kept falling. But inside Jake Merritt, something had begun to settle. Something unfamiliar and hopeful. Like the turbulence had passed. Like maybe the plane was finding smooth air again. 3 days later, Logan International Airport hummed with the familiar rhythm of movement, rolling luggage, clipped voices over intercoms, and the low murmur of travelers suspended between places. It was the kind of setting that made most people feel anonymous. That's what Grace had counted on when she booked the return flight. Only this time, she didn't fly alone. She sat beside Jake and Lucy in the airport cafe, tucked into a quiet booth near the windows overlooking the tarmac. Lucy was finishing off a blueberry muffin, swinging her legs beneath the table, while Jake sipped black coffee and stared thoughtfully out the glass, watching the snow turn to slush on the runway. The audition had gone beautifully. Lucy had played her heart out, fingers dancing across the keys like they'd been waiting for this moment all along. Afterward, Grace had clapped loudest of anyone in the room. Lucy beamed so hard her dimples stayed well into dinner. Jake hadn't said much that evening, but the look he gave his daughter afterward, one of pride, disbelief, and something deeper, harder to name, was something Grace knew she'd never forget. She had extended her stay one extra night, quietly shifting her flight. Jake had done the same. They hadn't talked about it. They didn't need to. Some choices weren't made with words. Grace pushed her empty cup aside and glanced at Jake. You know, you never asked me what I do. Jake shrugged, still watching the planes taxi by. Didn't seem important. Grace smiled. It's not. He looked at her, then eyes searching. But maybe it is. She tilted her head. Want to guess? He narrowed his eyes dramatically. Children's book illustrator. Grace laughed. That's flattering. Tax lawyer. Now that's insulting. Jake grinned. Okay. What then? Grace folded her hands, quiet for a beat. I run a company, Hollister Global. Jake blinked. That sounds familiar. It should. My father started it. Real estate, luxury developments, resorts, private aviation. I've been the CEO since he passed. Jake leaned back slowly. You're serious? I am. He was quiet for a long time. Then, so, you own a plane. She gave him a sideways glance. I own 8. Jake exhaled, let out a small chuckle and shook his head. Okay, that's definitely not where I thought this was going. Grace smirked. Does it change anything? Jake considered. Only makes me more confused why you'd trade a seat in first class to sit with a guy who irons his shirts with a hot coffee mug. She laughed so loudly the people at the next table glanced over. But then Jake's expression sobered. It doesn't change who you are to me, just explains a few things. Grace met his gaze. That's all I ever wanted. As they boarded the plane, Jake carried Lucy's bag, while Grace handed their boarding passes to the gate agent. The woman scanned them, looked up, and her eyes widened. Miss Hollister, she said, her voice shifting subtly, more polished, more deferential. Your flight crew has been notified. The pilot sends his regards. Grace nodded politely. Thank you, Martha. Jake raised an eyebrow once they were past. The pilot sends his regards. Grace shrugged with a small smile. I used to sit in the cockpit as a kid. My dad insisted I learn how everything worked. And now they recognize you by face. Sometimes, it used to make me feel safe. Now it just reminds me I can't hide for long. They took their seats row 14 this time. Still business class, but without the curtain between them and the rest of the world. Grace had requested it. No walls, no separation. As they settled in, a flight attendant approached. She was tall, silver-haired, and composed in that unmistakably flight crew way. Miss Hollister, she said with a nod, before turning to Jake. And you must be Mr. Merritt. We're honored to have you on board. Jake's mouth opened slightly. Thank you. The attendant smiled. Miss Hollister made a note on your reservation. She wanted to ensure your daughter had a view from the window and that her meal was peanut-free. Jake turned to Grace, stunned. How did you? Grace shrugged again. You mentioned it once. I listen. Lucy leaned across him and whispered, She's like a spy. Jake smiled. She's something. The flight was smooth. They played word games. Grace taught Lucy how to fold an origami fox from a cocktail napkin. Jake read part of an old Western novel from the back pocket of his jeans. The kind of flight that passes not just quickly, but warmly. Midway through, Grace excused herself to the restroom. On her way back, she stopped at the galley where the flight attendant from earlier stood pouring tea. Everything all right, miss? The woman asked. Grace hesitated. Then she asked quietly, Do they always look at me that way? The woman smiled gently. Sometimes. But not everyone is looking at your last name. Some of us are just grateful you're here. Grace blinked, not expecting that answer. Most of the people on this crew, the attendant added, heard about what you did on that last flight. Giving up your seat like that. Not everyone in your position would have, Grace's voice caught. It wasn't that big of a deal. It is, the woman said firmly. Because people notice kindness, especially when it comes from where no one expects it. Grace stood there a moment longer, her throat tight. Then she nodded and returned to her seat. Jake looked up when she sat down. "Everything okay?" She smiled through the lump in her throat. "Yeah. Just turbulence." He tilted his head. "Didn't feel any." "I did," she said softly. But it passed. He reached for her hand. This time she didn't hesitate. The wheels touched down in Denver with a gentle thud, and for a brief second, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then came the familiar chorus, seat belts clicking open too early. Overhead, bins creaking flight attendants, reminding passengers to remain seated. Grace stared out the window at the gray tarmac. The mountains crouched in the distance, like old, patient sentinels. The city she once called home looked different now. Or maybe she did. Beside her, Jake stretched his legs and reached into the seat pocket to grab Lucy's coloring book. She was still asleep, her head resting against his arm, her little fingers curled in the fabric of his jacket. "She's out cold," Jake whispered, smiling down at his daughter. "Too many muffins." Grace chuckled softly. "She's going to miss the landing. She won't mind. She's only ever cared about the cookies anyway." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. Grace knew in the quiet that something was shifting. She had thought returning to Denver would feel like waking up from a dream, but instead it felt like landing in a different version of her life, one that hadn't existed before Jake and Lucy. "I should get a rental car," she said suddenly, more to herself than him. "I left mine at the airport in Aspen." Jake glanced over. "You going back there?" Grace hesitated. "Eventually. I need to get some things. Deal with loose ends." Jake nodded, saying nothing. They filed off the plane together after the crowd thinned, Lucy still half asleep but walking with her hand in Jake's. The concourse was crowded, travelers rushing to make connections, faces buried in phones, or anxious with time. Grace moved slower than she used to, less performative. Her heels tapped quietly now, instead of echoing. They reached the baggage claim. Jake found their bags quickly, his beat-up duffel, Lucy's tiny backpack with unicorn stickers. Grace's suitcase, brand new and barely used, looked strangely out of place beside them. Shiny. Untouched. Jake picked it up without asking and set it gently next to her. "I've got a friend," he said casually, "who owns a repair garage just outside town. He's got a spare apartment above the shop. Not fancy, but warm. He lets me stay there when I bring Lucy up for hospital visits." Grace blinked. Hospital visits. Jake hesitated, then said softly, "Lucy was born with a mild heart murmur. Nothing too serious, but she has to do regular checkups with a specialist up here." Grace looked down at Lucy, who was now kneeling by the baggage carousel pretending to be a secret agent. Her eyes welled. "I didn't know. I don't tell most people." Jake shrugged. "It's just our life." She touched his arm gently. "She's lucky to have you." Jake gave a small smile. It goes both ways. They stood still for a moment, the chaos of the airport swirling around them like wind around a tree. Then Grace took a breath. "I'd like to see you again," she said. "I mean, not just today. Not just in passing." Jake studied her face. "You sure I've spent my whole life being sure about things that didn't matter," she said. "This matters." He nodded once. "Then I'd like that too." Outside, snow had begun to fall again, slow, deliberate flakes drifting down in soft spirals. Lucy bounced along beside them as they headed to the rental counter. She was humming under her breath, holding Grace's hand now with a familiarity that felt unspoken, but real. Jake walked slightly behind, watching them both with a cautious kind of joy, like someone afraid to name a thing in case it vanished. At the rental desk, the agent smiled as Grace approached. "Name Hollister," she replied, then paused. Grace Hollister. The man blinked, then straightened slightly. Ah, yes, of course. One moment. He returned with a clipboard and keys. You're confirmed for the Rolls-Royce Phantom, black heated leather GPS rear seat TV screens. Jake raised a brow. That's not a Corolla. Grace grimaced, then turned to the agent. Do you have a Subaru? The man faltered. Ma'am. Something that doesn't make people stare, she said gently, and preferably something with enough trunk space for a lunchbox and a violin. The agent glanced between them, uncertain, then nodded. We'll find you something. 15 minutes later, Grace loaded her bag into a dusty silver Forester. Lucy climbed into the back seat and buckled up, kicking off her boots with a yawn. Jake lingered by the passenger door. You driving alone to Aspen? Just for a day or two, Grace said. I need to close a few chapters. He hesitated. You want company? She looked at him. Really looked. Yes, but not for this part. I need to do this on my own. Jake nodded. Call me when you're back. I will. He started to step away, but she reached for his hand. Jake, yeah. Grace leaned in and kissed his cheek. It was gentle, not rushed. The kind of kiss that says, thank you, but also wait for me. She pulled back, eyes glistening. You gave up your seat that day on the plane, but you gave me more than that. Jake searched her face. What did I give you? A way out, she said. And maybe a way in. She drove away slowly, her silhouette fading into snow and taillights. Jake stood in the falling quiet with Lucy beside him, one hand in his pocket, the other holding hers. Is she coming back? Lucy asked. Jake looked at the road, then down at his daughter. I hope so. Lucy didn't answer. She just reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small and folded. She handed it to him. It was a napkin crinkled and smudged with a drawing of a fox in a bow tie. She gave it to me at dinner, Lucy said. Said it's our secret mascot. Jake tucked the napkin carefully into his wallet. Outside, the world kept moving. But inside Jake Merritt, everything had paused just long enough to believe again. It had been 8 days since Grace drove off into the snow. Jake counted them, not deliberately, but the way you track absence without meaning to. Each morning he packed Lucy's lunch, scribbled her a note, and made sure the thermos was warm. Each night he glanced at his phone one too many times. She hadn't promised a timeline, but some part of him, stubborn and hopeful, had waited anyway. Grace had texted once on the 3rd day. Just a single line. Still breathing. Taking care of business. You okay? Jake had replied with a photo of Lucy covered in finger paint and wrote, We're surviving. Not the same without you. Then silence again. By the 8th morning, Jake had started to accept the idea that maybe her world and his had just touched for a while, 2 planes passing in the sky. Not every story had a second chapter. But then on a Thursday afternoon, heavy with rain, a letter arrived. It wasn't delivered with the usual mail. Instead, a battered pickup truck pulled into the gravel lot beside his workshop. A man in a wide-brimmed hat stepped out, handed Jake a cream envelope sealed with wax, and nodded once. Miss Hollister said this needed to be hand-delivered. Before Jake could respond, the man tipped his hat and drove off. Jake turned the envelope in his hands. His name was written in blue ink. His full name, Jacob Emmett Merritt. Only 2 people alive used that middle name. One was his mother. The other was Grace once, when teasing him about sounding like a 19th century cowboy. He opened it carefully. Jake, I meant to call, but words spoken too soon often come out wrong. So I'm writing instead. I went back to Aspen. I returned the ring to the family safe. I met with the attorneys terminated. The merger stepped down from the board and handed over the penthouse keys. I walked away from the life everyone said I should want. And you know what? I didn't miss any of it. I missed Lucy's stories. I missed the smell of pancakes and crayons. I missed the way you say everything with so few words, like each one has weight. I missed the quiet, not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that feels like safety. But I didn't come back to Denver. Not yet. Instead, I came to Vermont. To the cabin I told you about, the one my grandmother left me. It's old and lopsided, and smells faintly of wood smoke and lavender. There's no Wi-Fi, no staff, no expectations. There's also a second bedroom with a tiny loft bed that I think Lucy would love, and a back porch where if you sit very still, you can hear loons calling across the lake at sunset. So here's what I'm asking. Will you come? No pressure, no promises, no fancy clothes or curated smiles, just you and Lucy. And maybe that lunchbox with the initials on it. I want to start something real. If you want that too, the door's unlocked. With hope, Grace. Jake read the letter twice, then once more, slowly. He ran his fingers over the edge of the paper, like it was something living, something breathing. He folded it carefully, placed it in the tin lunchbox next to Claire's napkin notes, and stood in the doorway of the garage. Rain misted the pavement, soft and cool. Behind him, Lucy called from the office. "Dad, can I bring my fox?" He turned. "Where are we going? I don't know. But I think he should come." Jake smiled. "Then he's coming." They left the next morning at sunrise. The drive to Vermont was long, but peaceful miles of rolling hills, winding roads, and stretches of maple trees just beginning to bud. Lucy played road trip bingo with herself and asked endless questions about loons. Jake answered the ones he could and made up answers for the rest. When they reached the end of the gravel road, Jake slowed the truck. A wooden sign hung over the gate. The Birch House. Moss covered the edges. A cardinal darted across the hood. Grace was on the porch. She wore a flannel shirt tucked into faded jeans, her hair pulled back in a braid. No makeup, no jewelry, just her. Her face lit up when she saw them, and Jake felt something inside him unfold like a paper airplane finally catching wind. Lucy was the first to climb out. She sprinted across the yard and threw her arms around Grace's waist. "You're real, Grace," laughed, crouching down. "I'm real." Jake followed slower, his heart in his throat. Grace straightened as he reached the steps. "You came," she said, her voice quieter now. "I read your letter," he replied. "You wrote it like someone who meant every word." "I did." They stood there for a beat, the moment suspended between what was and what might be. Jake reached into the back seat of the truck and pulled out the red lunchbox. "You still like oatmeal?" She grinned. "I've developed a strong preference." He handed it to her. "Then let's see what this next chapter tastes like." Grace took it from him like it was something sacred. Behind them, Lucy had already claimed the loft bed and was shouting down about the view of the lake. Grace looked up at Jake. "Stay a while." He nodded. "We've got nowhere better to be." The Birch House sat on the edge of a quiet Vermont lake, surrounded by birch and maple trees that whispered to one another in the breeze. The air smelled like pine needles and old timber, and the floorboards creaked with the kind of honesty only age could give. Jake noticed it first, not consciously, but as a quiet absence. There were no mirrors in the cabin, not in the bathroom, not above the mantel, not behind any door. He didn't mention it at first. Maybe it was a stylistic choice. Maybe they'd just been taken down during renovation. But by the third day, he was sure the mirrors were gone on purpose. And Grace. She seemed lighter here, slower, steadier. She woke with the sun barefoot on the porch, sipping tea from a mug chipped at the rim. She chopped vegetables with rhythm-stacked firewood without complaint, and played vinyl records that crackled with nostalgia. Lucy followed her like a shadow bouncing between kitchen and garden, asking questions, soaking up every minute. Jake had never seen his daughter so open, so uninhibited. He'd never seen himself so still. And yet the absence of mirrors tugged at him. It was late on the fourth evening after Lucy had gone to bed that he finally asked. They sat on the porch, two rocking chairs gently creaking under the stars. The air was cool, the sky velvet black and pricked with silver. Between them, a lantern flickered beside the tin lunchbox, now a permanent fixture holding napkins, letters, and Grace's carefully folded origami animals. Jake sipped his tea and said, "You know there isn't a single mirror in this whole place." Grace didn't flinch. She nodded slow. "I took them down." Jake waited. She inhaled deeply, holding the mug like a shield. "I've spent most of my life being looked at, judged, for my weight, for my face, for my name. Every room I walked into had a mirror reminding me how I failed to fit the picture." Jake said nothing. He just listened. Grace continued, her voice low. "As a teenager, I learned to smile while hating myself. As an adult, I learned to stand beside people thinner and taller and more marketable and pretend it didn't eat me alive." She looked up, eyes glistening. "It wasn't just the world that judged me, Jake. It was me. I was the worst of them all. Every mirror, every reflection, it was like looking at someone I disappointed." Jake's heart ached. "So you took them down?" "I took them down," she said. "And I started building a space where I could feel like a person, not a product. Where I could see myself through actions, not angles." She looked at him. Really looked. "You see me, Jake. Not for what I lack or how I look, but for who I am when I'm peeling carrots and making beds and laughing like I haven't in years. And I needed to be here to believe that was possible." Jake leaned forward, setting his tea aside. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" Grace hesitated. "Yes, I see a woman who left everything behind because she refused to be bought," he said. "I see someone who listens more than she talks, who makes space for people to feel safe. I see someone braver than anyone I've ever met." Her lip trembled. Even without mirrors, Jake reached for her hand, especially without them. The next morning, Lucy woke early and padded into the kitchen in her pajamas. She climbed onto a stool and helped Grace mix pancake batter while Jake brewed coffee. Grace handed Lucy a spatula shaped like a foxtail, her new favorite, and together they flipped misshapen pancakes with delight. Jake watched them from the doorway, the way sunlight curled around them like a blessing. Something in his chest tightened, but this time it wasn't grief. It was peace, and it scared him because it was the kind of peace that felt like home. That afternoon, Lucy discovered a box of Grace's old sketchbooks in a trunk upstairs. They were filled with drawings, faces, landscapes, dreams captured in pencil. On one page, Grace had drawn herself in profile, eyes, downcast, shoulders hunched. Lucy studied it, then ran to the kitchen. "Grace," she said, "I want to draw you now." Grace looked up from her pot of soup. "Me?" But smiling, Lucy said firmly, "Not like this one. This one looks lonely." Grace paused. "Okay, but only if you let me keep it." Lucy grinned. "Deal." That night, Jake found the new drawing tucked into the lunchbox. It showed Grace in her flannel shirt hair, messy laughing beside a girl with braids. It wasn't perfect. Lucy's crayon lines were wobbly, but it glowed with something truer than symmetry. Beneath the sketch, in careful handwriting, Lucy had written, "This is what happy looks like." Jake closed the lid gently, his throat thick. Later, as the three of them sat by the fire, marshmallows melting into cocoa and a blanket shared between them, Grace looked at Jake and whispered, "I used to think I'd only be loved despite who I was." Jake slid his hand into hers. "I love you because of who you are." She blinked, eyes wide, and then she rested her head on his shoulder. Outside the windows, stars wheeled in silence, and inside a cabin with no mirrors, two broken souls began to see themselves, finally through the eyes of love. The piano stood in the corner of the town hall, slightly out of tune and badly lit. But for Lucy, it may as well have been a Steinway at Carnegie Hall. The community center in Shelburne wasn't grand. The folding chairs squeaked, the floorboards creaked, and the stage curtains sagged at the edges. But the place was filled with something warmer than elegance belonging. Neighbors brought covered dishes. Teenagers giggled in corners. Grandparents nodded in rhythm with the music. Tonight's event was a local fundraiser for the food pantry, and when Grace had mentioned it to Lucy over breakfast, the girl's eyes lit up. "Can I play something?" she'd asked. Not for the prize, just because. Grace had hesitated, unsure, but Jake, sipping his coffee, had simply said, "If it matters to you, then yes." And now here she was, hair in two tight braids, white sweater with a sparkly fox patch, tiny hands folded on her lap as she waited her turn. Backstage, Grace stood beside Jake, watching her with a quiet reverence. "She's braver than I ever was," Grace whispered. Jake smiled. She learned that somewhere. Grace looked up at him. "From you?" Jake didn't reply. His gaze was fixed on his daughter, with a softness that was almost sacred. A man in a flannel vest called out the next performer, Lucy Merritt, age 7. Polite applause followed. Lucy stepped onto the stage with a nervous but determined expression. The moment she sat at the piano, the room hushed. Jake tensed. He knew how stage fright could creep in like a shadow at the edge of the spotlight. But Lucy closed her eyes, took a breath, and began to play. The melody was gentle, simple at first. But as the notes bloomed, it became clear this wasn't a song from any book. This was something original, something she had written herself. The room held still. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations died on the tongue. Even Grace stopped breathing. The song had no words, but it told a story. A quiet sadness at the start, soft and aching, that gradually shifted into a sense of discovery, like wandering out of a fog and into sunlight. Then came the part that made Jake's throat tighten, a soaring, hopeful refrain, punctuated by a few childlike flourishes. Not perfect, but true. When she reached the final note, Lucy paused with her hand still on the keys. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the room erupted. Clapping, whistling, even a standing ovation from the mayor, who'd spent most of the evening half asleep. Jake stood frozen, his hands in his pockets, too full of feeling to move. Grace turned to him, eyes bright with tears. "Jake, did you know?" He shook his head slowly. "I knew she had music in her. But that was something else." Lucy beamed as she climbed down, running into their arms backstage. Grace dropped to her knees. "Lucy, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. It's called The Woman in White." Lucy whispered, "It's about a bride who runs away but finds something better." Jake blinked, stunned. Grace covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Then Lucy added, "It's really about you." They drove home in silence, too full of emotion to speak. Snow had begun to fall again, light and lazy, dancing in the headlights. Back at the cabin, Jake lit the fire while Grace warmed milk in the kettle. Lucy curled up in her blanket fort beside the hearth fox plushie in one hand and her music notebook in the other. Jake sat beside Grace on the couch, their shoulders touching, eyes reflecting firelight. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "More than okay. She wrote that for you, Grace." "I know," she whispered. "That's what undid me." Jake reached over and took her hand. "I've been waiting for the right moment to say something. But I realized the right moment already passed. It was that night on the plane, and the next morning at breakfast, and every minute since, she looked at him heart-pounding. "I love you," Jake said. No dramatics, no bells or violins, just truth. Grace's eyes welled. "You love this me." He leaned in closer. "I only ever knew this you." Then he kissed her. Not like a movie kiss, no swell of music, just lips touching slow and sure, like the final puzzle piece snapping into place. And when they parted, she whispered, "I love you too." The next morning, Grace framed Lucy's sheet music and hung it above the piano in the corner. Under the title, "The Woman in White," Lucy had written in her neatest handwriting, "For Grace, who found her real song," and for my dad, who heard it first. Jake stood in the doorway reading the dedication. His throat tightened. Not from grief this time, but from a gratitude so deep it scared him. He looked around at the cabin, at Grace humming in the kitchen, at Lucy writing in her notebook, at the sunlight casting patterns on the wood floors. It wasn't a mansion, but it was home. The spring thaw came quietly to Vermont. The snow receded from the cabin porch like a shy guest excusing itself, and the first shoots of green poked up through the earth with quiet resolve. Jake found himself rising earlier than usual, not out of habit, but anticipation. There was something about the light in this place, the way it spilled through the windows like forgiveness. The cabin was never silent anymore. Mornings brought the hum of Grace's humming in the kitchen, the clink of ceramic mugs, the whisper of pencil on paper as Lucy filled her notebooks with songs and stories and foxes in bow ties. The air carried warmth, laughter, music, and something else he hadn't felt in years: belonging. One Sunday morning, Jake stood by the entryway wall, hammer and nail in hand. Grace watched him from the armchair, her legs curled beneath her, a book half open on her lap. "You sure about this one?" she teased. "You're putting it above the coat rack, high traffic area." Jake smirked. "That's the point. I want everyone to see it." He lifted the wooden frame in his hands. Inside it was the original boarding pass from that day, in Denver seat 2A first class. The corners were slightly creased. A faint smudge of lipstick touched the top edge Grace's, though she hadn't known it at the time. Below the ticket matted in ivory cardstock, Jake had added a simple caption in blocky hand-lettered script: "The seat I gave away. The life I never expected." Grace blinked slowly. "You kept it." Jake turned to her. "You changed everything in that seat." She shook her head soft with emotion. "You're the one who made the first move." "I just gave up a chair," he said quietly. "You gave up a whole world." He hung the frame with gentle care, stepping back to make sure it was level. It hung just beneath Lucy's crayon sketch of the woman in white, and beside a hook with Jake's old work cap from Colorado. The wall in its way had become a portrait gallery of their redemption. Later that afternoon, they took a walk around the lake, a Sunday ritual now. Lucy bounded ahead, her fox plushie tied to her backpack like a flag. She stopped occasionally to collect smooth stones or point out a hawk circling above the tree line. Grace and Jake walked behind her, hands linked hearts light. "I talked to the board," Grace said softly. Jake turned his head. "The Hollister board." She nodded. "I'm stepping back, not just for a few months, indefinitely." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You're walking away from a billion-dollar empire." She smiled. "I'm walking toward something better." They stopped near the shoreline where the lake's surface shimmered like old glass. A family of ducks glided by, and Lucy giggled in the distance. "I've been trying to prove something my whole life," Grace continued. "That I was worth the space I took up. That I wasn't a mistake in a world that wanted me smaller, quieter, more polished." Jake stayed quiet, listening the way he always did with his whole self. But here she said, "I don't have to prove anything. You see me. And Lucy, she believes in me in a way I didn't even know I needed." Jake looked at her, sunlight catching in her hair. "You were never a mistake, Grace." She smiled through her tears. "And you were never just a mechanic in the back of the plane." That evening, as dusk settled and the fire cracked in the hearth, Jake opened the tin lunchbox one more time. Inside, nestled among folded notes and Lucy's song lyrics, was Grace's handwritten letter from Vermont, the one that had brought them here. He read it silently, then added a new slip of paper beside it. This one was written in his own hand. "Some people wait their whole lives for a miracle. Some people give up a seat and find one instead." He closed the lid and placed it back on the mantel next to the framed boarding pass. Weeks later, on a rainy Tuesday, Grace stood at the front of the community center with Lucy at her side. The building had been recently renovated, funded partly by an anonymous donor the town suspected, but never confirmed was Grace herself. The new piano stood proudly on a raised platform, polished, tuned, waiting. The room was filled with familiar faces, teachers, neighbors, shopkeepers. Jake stood in the back, hands in his pockets, his eyes never leaving the girls. Grace cleared her throat. "I don't usually speak in public." She began, voice steady, but Lucy asked me to introduce her. And frankly, when Lucy asks, it's best to say yes. Laughter rippled gently through the crowd. "This piece is special," Grace continued. "It was written not just by a child, but by a heart wide open. It's about courage, about kindness, and about knowing when to walk away and when to walk toward." She turned to Lucy and smiled. "This is her gift to all of us." Lucy took her place at the piano, poised and calm. She didn't fidget, didn't glance nervously around. She simply began to play. After the final note, Grace felt Jake's hand slide into hers. They stood together in the back of the room as the audience applauded, not wildly, not theatrically, but with a reverence that came from witnessing something rare. When the crowd began to disperse, Lucy ran to them glowing. Jake lifted her into his arms and she giggled. "Did I do okay?" she asked. Jake kissed her temple. "You did better than okay." Grace knelt beside them. "You gave us a wedding song." Lucy tilted her head. "But no one's getting married." "Maybe not yet," Jake said with a smile, glancing at Grace. "But that doesn't mean we don't have a song." They walked out into the rain together, Jake carrying Lucy, Grace beside them under one shared umbrella. And in the distance, over the green hills and quiet lake, the first roll of spring thunder echoed like a drumbeat of something just beginning. We'd love to know where in the world are you watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and let's see how far this story of kindness and hope has traveled. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. We share true and inspired tales that remind us goodness still exists, and sometimes it finds us in the most unexpected places. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Your presence here means more than you know.